Is 2022 the year that Stadia finally dies? Well, in this video, we're going to discuss that. Now, spoiler alert, we don't think it's going to die, and you're probably not going to be that surprised considering how much we've covered it previously on the channel. So this is one of those questions that gets a lot of heat from both sides of the equation. We've got the people who absolutely believe that Stadia is dead. It's going to be dead very soon, or it's dead already and it's not going to go any further. You've then got the complete polar opposite and the Stadia fans that really band behind every single thing that comes out of Google Stadia and really celebrates absolutely everything. So let's have some discussion. Chat in the comments and let us know your thoughts as well, but keep it kind, keep it civil, and keep it well thought out as well. None of the Google Stadia is dead, lols, and all of that rubbish. Make sure you keep it on point and stuff like that. So let's get on with the video and talk about why we think that Google Stadia isn't going to die in 2022, but also a couple of things that it needs to do to make sure it doesn't actually, get the axe and stuff like that. So first up, anybody who's been keeping an eye on Google Stadia will know that last year they actually did quite a lot. Now they might not have had the, multitude wave of games that a lot of people were hoping for and some of the really big name titles, but they had a decent amount coming out, especially for their Pro subscription. But bigger than that was all the stuff that they were doing on the back end. Now if we put aside all of the technical stuff that makes Google Stadia such a great cloud gaming platform, and we look at the stuff that's been failing in previously, it's all things like getting developers on board and having all of that back-end stuff that will really entice people to use it. Now Google made a big song and dance at the Developers Summit all about how they've made it so much easier now that it's literally just a click of a button to port games across and make it compatible with Google Stadia. Now, a lot of people celebrated this and they were very excited about it, but obviously the naysayers got on board and said, well, where are all the games? It's gonna take time before those games end up on people's roadmaps and developers' roadmaps and all of that. So over the next sort of year, 2 years, that's when we will hopefully start to see the fruits of what Google have done. It's not just about the stuff they've been doing on the back end to get developers on board and make it easier. Obviously, they've made things like revenue share, they've made new affiliate programs, but they've also done a lot of stuff to the service itself. So in 2021, we saw new hardware get released in a bundle that makes Stadia just a little bit more up to date in terms of the hardware that you can use it on. They rolled it out so it would work on different Android TVs as well. So that way, if you didn't have something like the Chromecast, you'd be able to play it on the big screen through something like an Android TV. They introduced a search function, which is just mind-boggling that certain things weren't there already. They introduced new ways to play with friends, open up private and public lobbies as well. There were so many new features that came across to Google Stadia. Things like being able to stream directly from Stadia through to YouTube Live as well. That's a big standout for a lot of people who are really into that sort of thing. And when you look at some of the other cloud gaming platforms, there's a lot that's been introduced to Stadia that they just don't have. They might have the games library and all of that jazz, but they don't necessarily have all the technical side of things. So there's been a clear investment from Google. There's been time put into it to iron out the way that they can get developers on board. They've introduced new features. They've obviously had development teams working on making Stadia better for its user base, and it just seems like something that they wouldn't bother doing if they were going to give it the axe. Now the next thing to talk about is that ultimately cloud gaming is still very young. It's in its infancy. Ultimately it's been around for a while in terms of things like GeForce now, which launched like 9 years ago in its beta or whatever it was when it was a subscription model. It has been around for a long time in that respect, but nothing's really been on the consumer radar up until about 2 years ago now. A lot of these big companies know that ultimately this is a great way to generate revenue for them, and ultimately it is the future of gaming, or at least it has a place in the future of gaming. To dip their toes in now and then pull out so soon seems absolutely ridiculous and an absolute missed opportunity. Think about it. What do developers like? What do companies like? They love people being on a subscription model, and by getting people onto cloud gaming, they're getting people onto a subscription model. That was really difficult to say for some reason. They're getting people onto a subscription model, which means that they're continually paying into Google's bank. It makes a lot of sense for those big businesses rather than someone just buying hardware up front and then occasionally buying some games. If they're tied into something that they're paying for monthly, it's something that I guess it's their big wet dream. It's their big moneymaker ultimately. So it seems really premature for them to pull out. You just need to look at NVIDIA GeForce now. Like I said, they've been doing this now for about 9 years, but up until 2021 at the start, that's when it started to go live with a consumer tier, and beforehand it was always in a beta or an alpha, and they were constantly changing the way that they did things. They've obviously had the long game in sight, and they've known that cloud gaming is where they want to be, and it's a service that they really wanted to push and see take off. And I believe that Google and Stadia are in pretty much the same boat as Nvidia GeForce Now was, all those years ago. As time goes on, more companies are going to get on board with the cloud gaming thing. As internet improves, then more customers are going to take up that cloud gaming side of things. So it is a growing market. Like I said, it's still in its infancy at the moment. It's only going to grow. So to pull out right now and take away that proposition and product just seems absolutely ludicrous. So I can't see them doing that. I honestly believe that they are in it for some kind of long term. Whether or not it's to have the Stadia platform as its front and center piece, or if it's going to become more back-end tech for other streaming services, who knows, but I don't see Google taking it away. And the last thing to consider, and this is, I suppose, a bit of a debatable one, but ultimately there are people using the service. There's people paying for the service, there's people using the service, and there are people enjoying the service, regardless of what some of the big tech outlets say. We all see the doom and gloom stories about Stadia's dead, no one uses it, but realistically, you just need to look at the community, and there are people, and quite a lot of people, using it. Our videos get a lot of traction, and we're a really small channel ultimately, but a lot of people do come through and talk about their Stadia experience and how much they're enjoying it. So where there's a customer base and an opportunity to make money, again, a company isn't necessarily going to pull that away. Whether or not it's making profit, that's a whole different ballgame that we have no idea. But ultimately, there is a consumer base out there. There's a lot of people to give that free advertising because Google just chooses to do none of its own, which is really frustrating. We'll get on to. But ultimately, there's a lot of people who love this service, a lot of people using it, and a lot of people willing to spread the word. Now, that all sounds really rosy, and Google Stadia is going to be the biggest success in the world, but not necessarily. There's a lot of things that they do still need to kind of nail down to make sure that they either don't fall into obscurity or just get axed completely. And the first one is Google needs to talk about Stadia. There are just so many frustrating times where Google Stadia just falls into this kind of secrecy thing for Google, and I understand it from a certain perspective. They don't want to overpromise and then under-deliver and then get called out by other tech outlets. But by going radio silent, which they often do, it's just frustrating for the fan base, it's frustrating for everybody else. No one really knows what the next step for Google Stadia is, and that can make it hard for a lot of people to get on board with, especially with all this fear and doubt and everything that gets spread around about Google Stadia. Ultimately, the question then becomes, why would a brand new customer invest in something like Google Stadia versus xCloud or Nvidia GeForce Now when they're hearing all this fear and doom and that Google Stadia is going to die, and then they look to see what Google has to say, and Google has to say absolutely nothing. So that is frustrating, and they do need to fix that ultimately, in our opinion at least. This year also needs to be the year where they do start to bring some big name games over. Now, we did see a few last year. There's some really good standout ones that we really enjoyed, but ultimately it started to become a bit more of a Ubisoft, indie titles, and a lot of kids games as well. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, and a lot of the games were really fun to play, and there's some decent ones on the library, but this year they really need to nail it down. They started to lay down all the stuff to get developers over. Now they need to show that they can actually get them talking with Stadia and getting porting those games across to the platform. It's one of the biggest things that seems to hurt them. Whenever Google Stadia comes up in conversation, is people always talk about wanting some of those big name games, the Battlefields, the Call of Duties, the stuff like that. I don't necessarily believe it needs to have those particular titles on there, but it does need to be shouting out a little bit more when a new game gets announced or released. It needs to be kind of alongside them at least, talking about that coming across. For us, Google Stadia fits nicely alongside other cloud gaming platforms. It gives us some games to play, other platforms give us other games to play, but if people are looking to just have the one cloud gaming platform, then Google Stadia starts to fall aside, which is kind of frustrating. They've done a lot of work to make sure that the developers come across to them, now they just need to deliver. And the final thing that we'd absolutely love them to see is make it next gen. One of the great things about Google Stadia when it launched was you could play in up to 4K resolution, you got some fantastic graphics, and next gen consoles just weren't available. You couldn't buy them unless you bought them at scalper prices, but now they're starting to become more readily available. Ultimately, people might start to buy those next-gen consoles rather than get invested in a cloud gaming service. And the reason for that is a lot of those big titles, like your Far Cry 6, for example, haven't had that next-gen graphics. They haven't had 60 frames per second. There's been a lot of times where games have come across to the platform and they just haven't performed as well as something like the console versions. They haven't performed as well as other cloud gaming versions as well, and that can get really frustrating. Google Stadia now needs to kind of step up the hardware. I get it's a chicken and an egg situation where they need the customers in order to do that, that, but ultimately to be able to advertise this to people as the future, it needs to really deliver on being the future. We've had a perfectly playable experience from all of those games, but a lot of people are starting to get more and more vocal about the fact that they want the 60 frames per second or more like Nvidia GeForce Now is offering on its higher tiers. They want those next-gen graphics, again, like GeForce Now is offering, that the next-gen consoles are offering, and it's probably not going to be too long until xCloud starts offering that as well. So that's it for our reasons why we don't think that Google Stadia is going to die in 2022. I don't think Google Stadia is ever really going to die. Even if Google Stadia has an absolutely abysmal year this year, I personally think that we'll see it get rolled into another Google service, maybe like a Google Games Hub or something like that, where you can subscribe to it and get your cloud gaming and access to different applications on your phone and stuff like that. But as long as they have at least a decent year, I can't see it going away anywhere. They're ultimately playing the long game like pretty much all of the cloud gaming platforms are at the moment, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens in 2022. So let us know in the comments, do you think that Google Stadia is going to survive 2022? Honestly, like we said, we personally believe that it will do, but it's always interesting to hear what you guys have got to say. Like I said, keep it clean, keep it civil, no killing each other and all of that jazz, because we've only got a few subscribers and we don't want you killing each other. So, hope you've enjoyed that video. If you have, hit that like and subscribe button and come along for some more awesome cloud gaming content. In the meantime, we will see you soon. Bye.